The sun was a hammer over Grey Butte in the summer of 1881. It beat down on the cracked earth until the dust itself seemed to bake, rising in fine, choking clouds with every gust of hot wind. The sky was a vast, bleached-out blue, empty of promises. Thirst was a constant companion in town, a dry rasp in the throat and a tightness in the skin. Every sound was sharp and brittle, the creak of a wagon wheel, the slam of a screen door, the weary shuffle of boots on the wooden boardwalk. But the worst sound, the one that set everyone's teeth on edge, was the groan of the town well. It was located in the dusty square between the church and the blacksmith shop, a solitary structure of stone and weathered timber. The pulley mechanism shrieked with every turn, a high, metallic complaint that echoed the town's own misery. The rope, thick and frayed, lowered the bucket into the dark shaft with a hollow scrape. When it came back up, dripping and precious, the sound was never one of abundance. It was the sound of a leaky barrel, of a shallow promise, of not enough. The well was dying, and Grey Butte felt its own life draining away with it. A line of a dozen people snaked from the well, their shoulders slumped in the oppressive heat. They clutched empty buckets of tin and wood, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the slow, agonizing process. A woman fanned her flushed face with a tattered piece of cardboard. An old man leaned heavily on a cane, his breath a shallow wheeze. They didn't speak. There wasn't enough moisture for idle talk. Into this tableau of silent desperation rode Cade Hollis. He came not with a clatter, but with a soft thud of hooves in the thick dust. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, moved with the same weary economy as its rider. Cade swung down from the saddle, his movements fluid and unhurried. He was a tall man, built of long muscle and bone, tanned to the color of worn leather by a lifetime under the sun. His jeans were faded, his boots scuffed, and the lines around his eyes were etched deep from years of squinting at distant horizons. He led his horse to the trough, which was nearly empty, then turned his attention to the line. He didn't join it. Instead, he walked to the front, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic clink. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect to the waiting women, and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened dark hair. The sun immediately beat down on his head. He ignored it. "Let me take a turn," he said, his voice low and a little rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a question. The man at the pulley, a lanky farmhand with sweat stinging his eyes, nodded gratefully and stepped back. Cade took his place. He gripped the worn wooden handle of the crank, his calloused fingers finding familiar purchase. He leaned his weight into it, and the pulley began its agonizing squeal as the bucket descended once more. He worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, his body a simple machine of leverage and strength. He filled the bucket for the old man, then for the woman with the cardboard fan, his movements efficient and detached. He didn't meet their eyes, and they offered only clipped, murmured thanks before hurrying away with their sloshing cargo. Then it was Elise Rowan's turn. She was new to Grey Butte, having arrived only a month prior on the westbound train. She had set up a small seamstress shop in a rented room behind the mercantile, her presence as quiet and unassuming as the whisper of thread through cotton. But in a town as small and tightly wound as Grey Butte, new was a condition that took a long time to wear off. She stood now, her slight frame struggling with a wooden bucket that was clearly too large and heavy for her. It was a man's bucket, meant for hauling water to livestock, not for a woman's household chores. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rope handle, and a stray strand of honey-blonde hair had escaped her bun, sticking to her damp forehead. She shuffled forward, her gaze fixed on the dwindling water in the trough, her lips parted slightly. When Cade motioned for her bucket, she seemed to startle, as if pulled from a trance. She handed it over, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough and hot, hers was surprisingly cool. Cade sent her bucket down into the earth's throat. The crank groaned, the rope strained. He brought it up, slower this time, coaxing it. The bucket emerged, dark and dripping, nearly full. He swung it carefully over the stone lip of the well and set it at her feet. Elise bent to lift it. The weight was jarring. She staggered back a step, her arms trembling under the strain. Water sloshed over the rim, darkening the dust around her worn shoes. She bit her lip, straightened her shoulders, and took another shuffling step. That's when it happened. The heavy, waterlogged rope handle slipped in her grasp. The bucket tilted violently. To save it, she lunged, her fingers tangling in the rough hemp of the well's main rope that lay coiled on the ground. At the same moment, the weight of the next bucket being lowered caused the pulley to lurch. The rope snapped taut, pulling tight across her fingers, grinding them against the stone edge of the well. A sharp cry escaped her lips, more surprise than pain. She tried to pull her hand back, but the rope had her pinned. Before anyone else could react, Cade was there. He moved with a speed that was startling in the languid heat. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. One of his hands clamped down hard on the crank, stopping its motion instantly. His other hand, broad and strong, covered hers completely, pressing down, taking the pressure of the rope off her skin and onto his own. It was a swift, clean, impersonal motion. He freed her trapped fingers, his eyes fixed on the rope, not on her face. Elise cradled her hand to her chest, her heart hammering. A thin red line of blood was already welling up across two of her knuckles where the rough rope had sliced through the skin. It was the work of a seamstress to bleed from the prick of a needle, a small, domestic pain. This felt different. This was the country's raw, unforgiving touch. The moment was broken by a voice from the line, a low, venomous whisper that carried easily in the still air. Hollis blood always brings trouble to this well. Elise looked up. A few of the townsfolk were staring, not with sympathy for her, but with a cold, knowing suspicion directed at Cade. She saw them exchange glances. An older woman deliberately turned her back. The name Hollis seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy as the heat. She remembered hearing fragments of gossip in the Mercantile, stories about Cade's father, a man named Jebediah Hollis. There had been a dispute, years ago, right here by this well. Something about stolen cattle. A man had ended up dead, shot by Jebediah's gun. The law had called it self-defense, but the town had called it something else. They called it a stain, one that had apparently passed from father to son. Cade gave no sign he'd heard. His face was a mask of indifference. He finished drawing the next bucket, his movements as steady as before. But Elise saw the subtle tightening of the muscle in his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to set themselves, as if bracing for a blow. He was used to this. She looked from her bleeding hand to the spilled water, a dark, rapidly evaporating patch in the dust. The loss of it felt like a physical blow. She felt a wave of despair, sharp and sudden. It wasn't just the water. It was the heat, the isolation, the feeling of being clumsy and ill-equipped in this harsh, new world. Her voice was barely a whisper, lost under the groaning of the pulley. "Please." Cade paused, his hand on the crank. He didn't turn his head, but she knew he was listening. She swallowed the dryness in her throat and tried again, speaking a little louder. "Please, show me how to keep the water from spilling." For a long moment, he was silent. The only sounds were the creak of the well and the hot wind sighing through the eaves of the blacksmith shop. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers for the first time. They were guarded, wary, but they held no judgment. He looked at her trembling hands, at the heavy, awkward bucket, and a flicker of something understanding, perhaps passed through his gaze. He took off his hat again, a slow, deliberate motion. He held it in his hand, a sign of deference that felt strangely intimate in the public square. "Slow steps," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "Keep your eyes forward, not on your feet, and hold your breath when you move. It steadies the body." He gestured toward the bucket. "Let me show you." He lifted the heavy pail as if it were a teacup, his muscles barely registering the strain. He walked a few paces, his stride even and balanced, the water's surface barely trembling. He set it down gently. "It's not about strength," he said, still not looking directly at her. "It's about balance. You find the center. You hold it." Far down the dusty main street, in the cool, shaded interior of the Gray Butte Bank, Marlowe Clegg looked at his own version of balance. It was there in neat, black ink in the leather-bound ledger spread open on his polished oak desk. He traced a line of names with a manicured finger. Rowan, Elise, a small debt for supplies to start her shop. Miller, Thomas. Behind on his seed loan, Hollis, Cade, the largest debt of all. A mortgage on the vast winter pasture that bordered his ranch. A loan taken out by his father years ago. Clegg smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of his lips. The drought was a tragedy for most. For him, it was an instrument. The town well was the fulcrum. Every day it produced less water. The value of land with its own private water source, like the creek that ran through the Hollis winter pasture, skyrocketed. The town's desperation was his leverage. He didn't need to use force or threats. He just needed to wait. The heat, the thirst, the failing well. They would do his work for him. They would force Cade Hollis to sell, and Clegg would be there to buy, for pennies on the dollar. A sharp clang echoed across the square. The church bell was tolling noon. The sound was flat and dead in the heat-soaked air. A sudden gust of wind swept through the town, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and straw. It carried the smell of the blacksmith's forge, hot iron and coal smoke, and the scent of Cade's horse, of leather and sweat. It was the smell of hard labor, of a world that took more than it gave. Elise watched as Cade retrieved her bucket. He didn't fill it to the brim this time, leaving a few inches of space. He placed it carefully in front of her. He looked at her hand. "You should have the doc look at that," he said, his voice gruff. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, and swung himself into the saddle. He settled his hat back on his head, pulling the brim low to shadow his face. Without a backward glance, he nudged the buckskin into a slow walk, heading out of town toward the open, sun-blasted plains. Elise stood frozen for a moment, the blood on her knuckles already beginning to dry and tighten. She wrapped her good hand around the bucket handle, took a deep breath, and lifted. She kept her eyes forward. She took a slow, deliberate step, holding her breath. The water sloshed, but it didn't spill. Another step. The same. Her gaze drifted from the path ahead to the lone figure riding away, his silhouette shimmering in the heat. Her eyes weren't on the man, but on the hat. He wore the hat he had removed for her, twice. It was a simple thing, a piece of felt shaped to shield a man from the sun. But right now, it seemed to hold all the dignity and quiet decency that Gray Butte had forgotten. She took another step, her world reduced to the weight of the water, the sting in her hand, and the outline of a cowboy disappearing into the haze. The storeroom Elise rented was little more than a box of shadows and forgotten smells. It smelled of dry rot, of mice, and of the faint, ghostly scent of the sacked grain that had once been stored there. Dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the single, thick shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom from a high, grimy window. But it was a space of her own. For 3 days. She worked to claim it. She swept the floorboards until the raw, splintery pine showed through. She scrubbed the walls with a rag and a precious bucket of lye-laced water, her scraped knuckles stinging with the effort. She found an old shipping crate, turned it on its end to serve as a cutting table, and a smaller one for a stool. Her sewing machine, a heavy black iron Singer she had painstakingly paid for over 2 years, was her altar. She placed it near the door, where the light was best. The final touch was a length of clean white linen. It was unsold stock, too plain for a dress, but perfect for her purpose. She tacked it carefully over the inside of the large, barn-style door. When the door was propped open to catch the breeze, the linen billowed softly, a stark white flag against the town's relentless brown dust. It softened the harsh afternoon sun to a gentle, milky glow, turning her small workspace into a sanctuary of sorts. She threaded a needle with black silk, her movements precise and economical. Her shop was open. A sign, neatly lettered on a piece of scrap wood, hung from a nail outside E. Rowan, seamstress, mending alterations, fair prices, miles away, under the same unforgiving sky. Cade Hollis moved through his own routine of labor. He was at the Sweetwater Ranch, a sprawling cattle operation where he hired himself out for day work. He didn't work the herds much anymore. That required too much talking, too much coordination with other men. He preferred the solitary tasks of the yard. Today, he was mending tack. He moved down a long line of saddles slung over a rail, his hands working with the same quiet efficiency as Elise's. He checked each one for wear, his fingers probing the leather for cracks, testing the integrity of the stitching. He counted the cinches, oiled the metal rings until they shone dully, and replaced a frayed latigo strap with a new one, his awl punching through the thick hide with a series of satisfying thuds. The other ranch hands gave him a wide berth. They were a boisterous crew, their laughter and crude jokes echoing off the corral fence. Cade kept to the shaded side of the barn, his back to them, a silent figure absorbed in his work. He was aware of their sidelong glances, of the way their conversations sometimes dropped to a murmur when he passed. He had learned long ago to build a wall of silence around himself. It was easier than facing the constant barrage of questions in their eyes, the unspoken accusations that had followed him his entire life. He finished his work, collected his pay from the foreman without a word, and rode away, a solitary rider against the vast, empty landscape. He was a man who knew how to be alone, the heart of Gray Butte's social life, and the source of its most potent poison was the saloon. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, the place was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and sawdust. A tinny piano plinked away in the corner, ignored by the men gathered at the bar. Marlowe Clegg was not there. He never drank in public, but his influence was. A pair of dusty drovers were talking, their voices low. "Saw that new seamstress at the well today," one said, wiping foam from his mustache. "Hollis had to help her. Looked like she got her hand caught." His companion grunted, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She'd best be careful. Anyone who gets tangled with a Hollis ends up as dry as his family's well. That name's cursed." "It ain't a curse. It's a fact." A third man chimed in, leaning on the bar. "Old man Hollis shot a man over water rights. Now his boy can't even look at the town well without trouble finding him. It's like the ground itself remembers." The men nodded in solemn agreement. In a land where water was life, a sin committed over it was the most unforgivable kind. The rumor, already taken root, began to spread its tendrils through the dry, thirsty soul of the town. Elise's first week was slow. A few women brought her dresses with ripped seams or shirts with missing buttons. The work was steady, but the pay was meager. Every coin she earned was already spent on rent, on flour, on the kerosene for her lamp. There was nothing left over. On Friday, Reverend Miller stopped by, his round face etched with worry. He held out his black Sunday vest. The buttonholes were frayed, and a seam along the shoulder was threatening to give way entirely. "Mrs. Rowan," he began, his voice soft. "I'm afraid my wife's hands are too stiff with arthritis for this close work anymore. Could you possibly mend this before Sunday service?" Elise took the vest, her expert fingers assessing the damage. "Of course, Reverend. It will be ready by tomorrow afternoon." "Excellent. What do I owe you?" Elise hesitated. She desperately needed the 2 bits the job was worth, but she needed something else more. She thought of the long, hot walk to the well, the grueling work of hauling the heavy bucket, the portion of water she had spilled. "Reverend," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I don't have a spare coin to my name. If it's all the same to you, I'd rather be paid with a full bucket of water from the church's rain barrel, the one you keep for the baptisms." The Reverend blinked, surprised. Then a look of profound sadness crossed his face. He understood instantly. In Gray Butte, water had become more valuable than silver. "My child," he said, his voice thick with pity, "it would be my honor. I'll bring it myself tomorrow." The next day, as she was putting the finishing touches on the Reverend's vest, a shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up, expecting the Reverend, but it was Cade Hollis. He stood just outside, his tall frame blocking the sun. He didn't say a word. He held his hat in his hands, just as he had at the well. In his other hand, he held a small object. He took a single step inside, placed the object on the edge of her cutting table, and then stepped back out. Before she could find her voice to speak, He had turned and was walking down the street, his long stride eating up the dusty ground. On the table sat a small, wooden spool of thread. It was a brilliant, startling blue, the color of a mountain lake, a color she hadn't seen since leaving the green hills of the east. It was a luxury, a thread for embroidery or fine detailing, not for mending worn-out farm clothes. It was completely impractical and utterly beautiful. She picked it up, the smooth wood cool against her skin. There was no note, no explanation, just a silent, anonymous gift. That night, long after the rest of Grey Butte was asleep, Elise sat in the quiet of her room, the only light coming from her small kerosene lamp. The Reverend's vest was done and delivered, and a full bucket of clean water sat gleaming in the corner, her most prized possession. She was mending one of her own blouses, reinforcing a collar that had grown thin. She worked with the new blue thread, sewing a delicate, almost invisible line of stitches along the edge. Her hand was steady now, but her mind kept drifting back to the well. She remembered the shock of the rope tightening, the searing pain across her knuckles, and then the feeling of Cade's hand. It hadn't been gentle. It had been firm, solid, and completely impersonal, a human shield placed between her and the raw mechanics of the well. It had taken the pain onto itself. Her needle paused in midair. She touched the faint, healing scab on her hand, and for a reason she couldn't explain, her fingers trembled. A few days later, the weekly mail coach brought a letter. It was from Finn, a bright, freckle-faced boy of 10, one of her former students from the small schoolhouse she had taught at before coming west. His family had moved to a neighboring territory, but he had promised to write. She smiled as she read his childish scrawl, his news of a new puppy and a loose tooth. But the last lines of his letter made her smile fade. He had passed through Grey Butte with his father last week. He wrote, "Pa says you got to be careful in that town. Miss Elise, he says people there believe a rumor faster than they believe good news. I hope they are being good to you." His childish warning proved prophetic. The very next morning, a new notice was posted on the wooden beam above the town well. It was written in Marlowe Clegg's precise, elegant script, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood it was nailed to. Notice, effective immediately. A fee of 5 cents per family per week will be levied for use of the town well, to cover maintenance and upkeep. Fees are to be paid directly to the Grey Butte Bank. Debts past due water access, denied. A cold knot of dread formed in Elise's stomach. 5 cents. It might as well have been $5. It was a sum she simply did not have. A crowd had gathered around the well, their voices a low, angry buzz. They were trapped. Clegg owned the bank, held most of their loans, and now he was claiming ownership of the very water they needed to survive. That evening, Elise stood in her doorway, watching the sky fade from a bruised purple to a deep, starless black. Her 2 buckets, the large one from the well and the smaller one the Reverend had given her, stood empty beside the door. The linen sheet she had hung with such hope stirred in the hot, dry breeze. The town was quiet, a tense, simmering silence. She looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, a sky that had withheld its mercy for so long. She whispered to the silent air, her voice so soft it was barely a sound. If compassion had a form, it would surely be as heavy as a full bucket of water. The night offered no relief from the day's heat. The air in Cade's small bunkhouse was thick and still, smelling of old leather and dust. He sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his shirt off, the faint moonlight striping his torso through the single window. He ran a hand over his ribs, his fingers tracing the familiar, jagged line of a scar that ran from his side to his back. It was a pale, puckered thing, a permanent frown in his skin. The touch was automatic, a habit he wasn't even aware of, like a tongue probing a missing tooth. His mind slipped back a year, not to a hot, dry night, but to the blinding fury of a freak spring blizzard. The world had been a vortex of white, the wind a physical force that stole breath and froze tears. A dozen new calves, separated from their mothers, were drifting toward an old, rusted line of barbed wire, their bawling lost in the howl of the storm. He'd found them pressed against the fence, too panicked and stupid to turn back. There was no time to herd them around. He had to go through. He'd taken his wire cutters, snipped the top strand, and held it up, the metal so cold it burned his gloves. The wire screamed with tension. He shoved the first calf through, then the second, the third. Terrified, had bolted sideways, knocking him off balance. He fell against the lower strand. He felt no pain at first, just a deep, tearing cold. The wire bit through his jacket and shirt, a hot, vicious kiss of metal that laid him open to the bone. The world had narrowed to a flash of white snow and red pain. He had gotten the rest of the calves through before he allowed himself to fall. The physical scar was a simple thing. It ached when the weather turned. But it was the other scars, the invisible ones, that hurt in the quiet moments like this. The scar on his name. He remembered his father, Jebediah, a man as weathered and unyielding as the granite hills. They had been sitting by the town well, the very one that was now the town's crucible. Cade was just a boy, his ears burning from the whispers that followed them everywhere after the shooting. He'd asked his father why he didn't fight back, why he didn't shout down the lies. Jebediah had finished drawing a bucket of water for a neighbor before he answered. He'd looked at his son, his eyes clear and steady. "Don't you ever bow your head to a rumor, son," he'd said, his voice low and even. "A rumor is just hot air. It can't quench a thirst or grow a single blade of grass. You stand straight, you look a man in the eye, and you let your work do the talking." He had gestured with his chin toward the woman walking away with her water. "You only bow your head to let another soul drink first. That's the only time." Cade held on to those words like a creed. He had never bowed his head to the talk, but he wondered if standing straight was enough when the whole world seemed to be leaning against you. In her small room behind the shop, Elise worked by the soft, steady glow of her kerosene lamp. The rhythmic click and whir of her sewing machine was the only sound. She was finishing a set of curtains for the mercantile owner's wife, a small but welcome job. She guided the fabric under the needle, her fingers deft and sure. In the yellow light, her fingertips seemed to glow. They were a map of her life, a constellation of tiny, silvered scars from 1,000 accidental needle pricks. They were the marks of her trade, the price of her independence. Each pinprick was a memory. She thought of Arthur. Their engagement had been the talk of her town back east. He was a banker's son, handsome, with smooth, uncalloused hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had loved the idea of her, the quiet, demure schoolteacher who could also create beautiful things with her hands. He saw her skill as a charming hobby, a domestic art to be displayed. He'd brought her to a dinner with his parents, and she had proudly shown his mother a piece of intricate lacework she'd made. "Exquisite," his mother had said, her voice dripping with condescension. A lovely pastime for a wife. Later that evening, Arthur had taken her hands in his. He'd run his thumb over her calloused fingertips. "My darling," he'd said, his tone one of gentle correction. "A man of my standing needs a wife who is an ornament, a reflection of his success, not a laborer. Once we are married, you will, of course, put all this aside." He had gestured vaguely at her sewing basket, as if it were a pile of dirt she had tracked into his pristine life. She hadn't argued, she hadn't cried, she had simply looked down at her hands, at the tiny, honest wounds of her work. These marks were not a hobby. They were her. They were the proof that she could make her own way, that she could create not just beauty, but sustenance. They were the symbols of her self-worth. The next morning, she had returned his ring. 2 months later, she had used her savings to buy a train ticket west, seeking a place where her work would be seen not as a liability, but as her very foundation. She looked at her hands now, under the lamplight in Gray Butte. She had escaped being an ornament. But here, her survival was just as precarious. The saloon was buzzing. The new well fee was the main topic of conversation, a shared grievance that bonded the men in a sour, angry camaraderie. Kip Dorney, a man whose loyalty to Marlowe Clegg was as obvious as the sheen of grease on his hair, saw his opportunity. He sidled up to a group of ranchers at the bar. "It's a shame, is what it is," Dorney said, loud enough to be heard over the piano. Clegg's just trying to keep the well from running dry for good. Takes money to maintain a thing like that. He took a swig of his beer. But some people, they expect everything for free. He let the statement hang in the air. Take that new seamstress, for example, Miss Rowan. He said her name with a slimy familiarity. Comes here with nothing but a sewing machine and a pretty face. Puts on airs, like she's too good for the rest of us. But I hear from the mercantile she's already running up a bill for thread and cloth, a bill she can't seem to pay. The lie was slick and plausible. In a town where credit was tight and cash was king, the accusation of being a debtor was a serious stain. It painted Elise not as a hard-working newcomer, but as a flighty, irresponsible woman, another burden on a town already stretched to its breaking point. Cade had just stepped through the swinging doors, intending to get a single bottle of whiskey to take back to his bunkhouse. The dust of the day was a grit in his throat, and he wanted something to cut through it. He heard Elise's name. He stopped, his hand still on the door, and listened as Kip Dorney spun his poison. Cade's world, which had been focused on the simple act of buying a drink, suddenly snapped into sharp, ugly focus. He saw the nodding heads, the looks of knowing contempt on the faces of the men at the bar. They were accepting the lie, swallowing it whole like cheap whiskey. He thought of his father's words. Stand straight. Look a man in the eye. He thought of Elise at the well, her face pale with effort, her knuckles bleeding. He saw the spool of blue thread on her table, a small splash of color in her world of dust and work. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the bar, his spurs ringing out in the sudden quiet that his presence always seemed to create. He ignored the stares. He looked directly at Kip Dorney, his gaze flat and hard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and emptied its contents onto the bar. A collection of worn silver dollars and small denomination coins clattered onto the wood, a sound louder than a gunshot in the tense room. How much does she owe? Cade's voice was low, but it cut through the murmurs. Dorney was taken aback, a flicker of panic in his shifty eyes. I ain't sure of the exact amount. Then this should cover it, Cade said, pushing the pile of money toward the bartender. Consider her debt at the mercantile paid. He turned his cold gaze back to Dorney, who shrank back slightly. Instead of spreading talk, Cade said, his voice dropping even lower, pay her debt for her, since you're so concerned. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned on his heel and walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned silence and a pile of silver shining on the bar. The news traveled through Gray Butte on whispers, faster than a horse could gallop. By the next morning, everyone knew. Cade Hollis had, in a grand public gesture, paid the debts of the new seamstress. Elise heard it from the Reverend's wife, who had come to pick up a mended tablecloth. The woman told the story with a tone of hushed admiration for Cade's chivalry. But as Elise listened, a hot, creeping flush of color rose from her neck to her cheeks. It was the color of deep shame, not relief. She felt as though she had been stripped naked in the town square. Her work was her honor. Her ability to pay her own way, slowly and honestly, was the bedrock of her existence. Cade's act, however well-intentioned, had shattered that. He hadn't saved her reputation. He had branded her. He had turned her from a hard-working woman into a charity case, a damsel in distress who needed a man to rescue her from a few dollars of debt. A debt, she fumed inwardly, that she had fully intended to pay with the money from the very curtains she was now handing to the Reverend's wife. That was very kind of him, Elise managed to say, her voice tight. She folded the tablecloth with trembling hands. She wanted to scream. She wanted to find Cade Hollis and throw his silver dollars back in his face. He had paid with coins, but he had stolen her standing. He had silenced the whispers of debt by starting a whole new chorus of speculation about her and him. Later that day, Cade saw her from across the street. She was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her shop, her movements stiff and angry. Her back was ramrod straight, a straightness that looked fragile, like glass. She didn't look up, didn't seem to notice him, but he felt the wall of her humiliation as if it were made of stone. And in that moment, he understood. He had seen a woman being attacked by whispers and had tried to shield her with the only thing he had: money and a blunt challenge. But he hadn't shielded her. He had trampled her pride. He had acted just like the men in the saloon, assuming he knew what she needed. He had tried to save her the wrong way. His father had taught him to stand straight against rumors, but he'd never taught him that sometimes. The best way to help someone else stand straight is to simply stand beside them, in silence, and trust in their strength. The hot wind picked up, rattling the loose pane of glass in the mercantile window. It whistled through the broken slat in a nearby gate. A lonely, mournful sound. Across the square, the solitary cottonwood tree by the well stood its ground, its leaves twisting and turning in the wind, showing their pale undersides. It looked completely, stubbornly alone, just like him, and just like her. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. In the suffocating stillness of the gray butte night, a single shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the alley beside the mercantile. Kip Dorney moved with the furtive, twitching energy of a rodent, his eyes constantly scanning the empty street. The only sounds were the creak of his own boots on the dust-caked boardwalk and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. He carried a small, heavy wrench wrapped in a piece of burlap to muffle any clang of metal against metal. His destination was the town well, standing like a skeletal sentinel in the center of the square. Marlowe Clegg's instructions had been simple, delivered with a cold smile over a glass of expensive brandy in his office. An accident, Clegg had said, swirling the amber liquid. Unfortunate, but inevitable. When public property is poorly maintained, people will be angry. They will look for someone to blame. They will demand competent oversight. Dorney understood. He was Clegg's blunt instrument, the hand that did the dirty work his employer was too refined to touch. He reached the well and cast one last look around. The town was asleep, dreaming its dry, thirsty dreams. He set to work. The pulley mechanism was mounted on a thick oak crosspiece, held in place by two heavy iron bolts. It was a simple, robust design, meant to last a century, but nothing is robust against a determined man with a tool. He found the bolt on the far side, the one least visible from the street. He fitted the wrench to the nut. It was tight, seated deep into the wood by years of use. He put his weight into it, his knuckles scraping against the rough timber. The nut resisted, then gave with a low, grating protest of metal. Dorney smiled in the darkness. He didn't remove it entirely. That would be too obvious. He just loosened it, turn by agonizingly slow turn, until the bolt was held by only a few threads. It looked secure, but under the strain of a full, heavy bucket of water, it would fail. The pulley wheel would lurch, the rope would jump, and the whole apparatus would jam. He imagined the scene in the morning, the chaos, the frustration, the anger. The women, gathered for their daily ritual of survival, would be the first to find it. They would blame the town council, the reverend, anyone in a position of authority. And Marlowe Clegg would be there, a voice of reason in the chaos, ready to offer a solution, ready to take control. Dorney gave the nut one final, delicate turn, then wrapped his wrench and slipped back into the shadows, leaving behind a trap baited with desperation. Elise woke before the first hint of dawn. Sleep had been a restless, shallow thing, and she rose with a feeling of gritty unease. The memory of Cade Hollis paying her supposed debt still burned in her cheeks. She couldn't face the line at the well, the inevitable stares, the whispers she couldn't quite hear but could feel like a physical touch. She would go now, in the cool, gray stillness of pre-dawn, and fetch her water in private. She dressed quickly and picked up her bucket. The town was silent as she walked through the empty street. A lone dog barked from a distant yard. The air was cool for now, a temporary reprieve. In the pale, ethereal light, the well looked different, ancient and imposing. She set her bucket down and took the crank handle. The wood was cool and smooth under her palm. She began to lower the heavy oak bucket into the earth. The pulley let out its familiar, agonizing squeal, but she thought she detected a slight, unnatural wobble in the sound, a subtle hitch in its rhythm. She dismissed it as a trick of the early morning quiet. The bucket hit the water with a distant, hollow splash. The sound echoed up the stone-lined shaft, a promise of relief. She let it sink, then began the long, arduous task of cranking it back up. The weight was immense. Her shoulders strained, and the muscles in her back and arms burned. The bucket rose, inch by painful inch. She could see it now, a dark shape emerging from the blackness, dripping, blessedly full. It was just as the bucket cleared the lip of the well that Dorney's sabotage took effect. With a sound of screaming metal, the loosened bolt gave way. The entire pulley mechanism lurched violently to one side. The heavy, waterlogged rope, suddenly without its guide, jumped from the groove of the wheel. It crashed against the splintered wood of the axle mount, the hemp fibers grinding, threatening to snap under the sudden, shearing force. The crank was ripped from Elise's hands, spinning wildly. Her own bucket, which she had placed near the well's edge, was caught by the lashing rope and knocked over, teetering on the brink of the dark shaft. She cried out, a sharp, instinctive sound of alarm, and lunged for it, her hands flailing. She was too late. But Cade Hollis was not. He had been in the small livery stable at the edge of town, unable to sleep, checking on a lame horse. He had heard her cry, a single, sharp note of distress in the morning's quiet symphony. He moved without thinking, his long legs covering the distance across the square in a matter of seconds. He saw the scene in a single, terrifying glance: the tilted pulley, the fraying rope, Elise reaching, the whole structure groaning under a strain it was never meant to bear. He didn't shout, he acted. He reached the well in a final, lunging stride. In one fluid motion, he ripped the hat from his head. He didn't toss it aside. He folded it violently in on itself, a thick, desperate wad of felt and leather. He jammed it, hard, into the space between the grinding rope and the sharp, splintered wood of the crosspiece. The effect was immediate. The felt of his hat, thick and resilient, acted as a brake, a buffer. The rope, which had been moments from snapping, bit into the soft material instead of the cutting wood. The entire mechanism shuddered to a groaning, protesting halt. Dust and splinters rained down. The silence that followed was shocking, broken only by Elise's ragged, panting breaths. Her bucket had fallen, not into the well, but onto its side, its precious contents spilling into the insatiable dust. She stood frozen, her hands still outstretched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her gaze was fixed on the mangled remains of Cade's hat, wedged deep into the broken mechanism, a sacrifice that had saved the well, and possibly her hands, from being torn apart. She turned to him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrifying understanding of what had just happened. She was trembling, not from the cool morning air, but from a deep, internal quake of fear and frustration. This place, this life, it was all so hard, so unforgiving. Every small victory was met with a new, more difficult trial. She felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged gasp, the words torn from a place deeper than thought. Please, show me what love is supposed to feel like. It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a confession of romantic feeling. It was a plea from a soul that had been shown only conditional affection, possessive pride, and now, the cold, sharp-edged cruelty of a town that fed on weakness. It was a desperate, elemental question. In a world this hard, how do good people hold each other up? What does support, real and unconditional, feel like? Cade looked at her, and for the first time, the guard in his eyes fell away. He saw not just a frightened woman, but a reflection of his own embattled existence. He understood her question in his bones. He knew it wasn't about kisses or soft words. It was about the mechanics of survival, the engineering of trust. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer empty comforts. He looked from her trembling form to the broken well, to the heavy rope that still held a full bucket suspended over the abyss. His answer was practical. His answer was work. 2 hands share the load, he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the churning sea of her fear. He took one side of the thick, greasy rope. He looked at her, waiting. She hesitated for a second, then took the other side, her smaller hands gripping the rough fibers next to his, eyes straight ahead. He continued, his gaze fixed on the task before them. Don't look down. Don't look back. And don't be afraid of the noise the crowd makes behind you. It was a creed. It was a lesson. It was the answer to her question. Love, in this place, was not a feeling. It was an action. It was the shared, deliberate, difficult work of pulling something essential up from the darkness. Together, they pulled. It was an awkward, grueling task without the aid of the pulley. The rope was heavy, slick with water and algae. His raw strength and her smaller, steadier pull, hand over hand. They fought for every inch. The rope burned their palms. Their muscles screamed. The bucket swayed, but they held it. It rose, slowly, painfully, clearing the stone lip of the well. Water sloshed over the side, but they didn't let it fall. They landed it on the stone surround with a heavy, solid thud. It was only half full, but it was theirs. They had saved it. They stood panting, their shoulders heaving, their hands raw. And then a new voice, smooth as oiled leather, cut through the morning air. My dear, are you all right? What a terrible thing to happen. Marlowe Clegg emerged from the shadows of the mercantile's awning, his clothes immaculate, his face a mask of concerned civility. He took in the scene with a practiced eye the broken pulley, the exhausted man and woman, the spilled water. He clucked his tongue in sympathy. It seems this old well has finally given up, a piece of public property, left to decay, a tragedy waiting to happen. He turned his gaze on Cade, and his voice hardened almost imperceptibly. A well, like a ranch, requires proper management. Hollis, constant upkeep, it's a responsibility. He let the word hang in the air. Perhaps it's time you considered divesting yourself of assets you can no longer properly maintain. Sell me the winter pasture. You could use the money to leave this unfortunate place. Cade straightened up, his breathing still heavy. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't get angry. He looked Clegg directly in the eye, his own gaze clear and unyielding. The well belongs to the town, he said. The statement was flat, simple, and absolute. It was not an argument. It was a fact. Elise saw it then, a dark smear of blood on Cade's hand, where his knuckles had been scraped raw when he jammed his hat into the splintered wood. Without thinking, she reached into the small sewing basket she had brought with her, pulling out a scrap of blue linen, the same brilliant color as the thread he had given her. She stepped forward and gently took his hand. He flinched, but didn't pull away. She carefully, silently, wiped the blood and grime from his torn skin. A sudden scuttling sound made them both look down. A lean, gray rat, disturbed from its home in the well's stone foundation, darted across the square and disappeared into the alley. At the same moment, a shadow detached itself from the deep darkness beside the blacksmith shop and slipped away. A silent, guilty retreat. It was the shadow of a man, the shadow of Kip Dorney. After the chaos of the morning, a fragile, temporary truce settled over the town square, under the direction of the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus. A few of the townsmen managed to heave the broken pulley mechanism off the well and lay it on the dusty ground. The well itself was declared unusable, a gaping, silent mouth in the earth. The townsfolk dispersed, their shoulders slumped, their faces grim, the specter of a waterless day looming over them. Marlowe Clegg had made a show of donating a barrel of his own private water to the church for emergencies, a gesture of magnanimity that cost him little and bought him a great deal of public goodwill. Elise remained long after the others had gone. She couldn't shake the image of the pulley lurching, the sickening sound of metal giving way. It hadn't felt like an accident. An accident was a rope snapping from age or a wooden handle cracking under strain. This had felt different. This had felt like a betrayal. She knelt beside the heavy oak crosspiece where it lay in the dust. The townsmen had dismissed it as rotten wood and old iron, but Elise's life was built on the careful observation of details others overlooked. It was how she could see that a seam was about to fail before it ripped, or how a single loose thread could unravel an entire garment. She ran her fingers over the splintered wood where the bolt had torn free. The wood was old, yes, but it wasn't rotten. The break was fresh, violent. Her attention went to the bolt itself, which Gus the blacksmith had retrieved. It lay beside the crosspiece, its threads stripped and mangled. But it was the other end, the head of the bolt, that drew her eye. There were fresh score marks on it, deep gouges in the metal, the unmistakable signature of a wrench applied with force, and something else, a dark, greasy smear in the grain of the wood around the bolt hole. She leaned closer. It wasn't the thick black grease used for wagon axles, nor the animal tallow used to condition leather. This was a thinner, finer oil, with a sharp, chemical scent she couldn't quite place. It smelled manufactured, clean, a memory, faint and unimportant at the time, surfaced in her mind. It was from her first week in town, when she had been looking for a room to rent. She had inquired at the back of the mercantile, and the owner had pointed her toward a large storage warehouse behind the bank. Belongs to Mr. Clegg, the man had said. He keeps his own generator back there for the bank and other private business. Nothing for rent there, I'm afraid. Strictly no admittance. As she had stood there, a man she now recognized him as Kip Dorney had opened the heavy warehouse door to roll out a barrel. For a brief moment, a wave of air had washed over her, carrying the hum of machinery and a distinct, sharp odor, the same odor that now clung to the broken heart of the town well. She stood up, her mind racing. A smell was not proof, a memory was not evidence, but it was a thread. And Elise knew what to do with a thread. You followed it. She found Cade by the livery, reshoeing his own horse. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil was a steady, solid sound in the anxious quiet of the town. He worked with a focused intensity, his back to her, the muscles in his shoulders and arms moving with fluid power. He didn't seem to have noticed her approach. It wasn't an accident, she said, her voice clear and direct. He didn't stop his work, but the rhythm of the hammer blows faltered for a fraction of a second. He finished seating the nail, then turned, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. His eyes were wary. What did you see? He asked. She told him everything. The score marks on the bolt, the strange, thin oil, the memory of the smell from Clegg's warehouse. She spoke in a low, even tone, laying out the facts as if she were describing the pattern for a dress. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He looked at the mangled felt and leather ruin of his hat, which he had retrieved and set on a nearby post. When I was running toward the well, he said finally, his voice rough, I saw a shadow slip away from the blacksmith shop. A man. I thought at the time he was just getting out of the way. He looked at her, his eyes dark. It was Dorney. The two pieces fit together with a sickening click. Dorney, the shadow in the dawn. Dorney, the man at the warehouse. Dorney, the man who had spread lies about her in the saloon. And behind Dorney, the unseen hand of Marlowe Clegg. The blacksmith, Cade said, his voice hardening. Gus. He sees everything that comes and goes in this town. If Dorney needed a tool, or a part. He didn't finish the sentence. He dropped his hammer, his movements suddenly sharp and purposeful. Wait here. He strode across the square to the blacksmith's forge. Elise watched him go, her heart a tight knot in her chest. She had the what. He was going to find the how. The forge was a cavern of heat and noise. Gus, a man with arms as thick as tree limbs, was hammering a glowing orange horseshoe into shape on his anvil. He acknowledged Cade with a grunt. Gus, Cade said, getting straight to the point. You do any work for Kip Dorney lately? Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. That weasel comes sniffing around sometimes, fancies himself a wheeler dealer. He gave the horseshoe another ringing blow, came by 3 days ago, needed a bolt for a pulley winch. Said he was fixing a gate out on his claim. This pulley winch, Cade said, keeping his voice level. It would use a bolt the same size as the one on the town. Well, Gus stopped hammering. He set the horseshoe into a trough of water, where it hissed and steamed. He turned to face Cade, his eyes narrowed. Now that you mention it, it was the exact same size, an uncommon size. Had to special order it for him a while back. He wiped his hands on his leather apron, a thoughtful frown on his face. Funny thing, though, The one I ordered for him was high-tensile steel. Cost a pretty penny. The one he bought 3 days ago. He brought it with him. A cheap piece of cast-iron junk. Looked like it would snap if you sneezed on it too hard. Why would he buy a cheap replacement when you already ordered him a better one? Cade asked. Gus shrugged his massive shoulders. Said he was in a hurry. Didn't want to pay the full price for the good one. I told him the cheap one was liable to fail. He didn't care. The blacksmith's eyes hardened with understanding. I still got the invoice for the special order. He never paid for it. Never picked it up. Just left me holding the bag. Cade's jaw was tight. I need that invoice, Gus, and I need the cheap bolt you sold him. Gus disappeared into the clutter of his shop and returned a moment later. He handed Cade a crumpled, grease-stained piece of paper and a heavy iron bolt, identical in size to the one from the well, but visibly inferior in quality. It was a shoddy, counterfeit piece of hardware, designed to fail. Cade returned to the livery stable and laid the items on a workbench in front of Elise. The bolt, the invoice, the evidence. It was all there. Cold, hard, and irrefutable. Elise picked up the invoice. It was dated 2 weeks prior, a special order for 1 high-tensile steel bolt, size and thread specified, for Kip Dorney. She then looked at the cheap, broken bolt from the well. They had a motive, a tool, and a perpetrator. She went to her sewing basket. She took out a large, uncut piece of the same blue linen from the scrap she had used on Cade's hand. She threaded a needle with matching blue thread. Her hands moved with a newfound purpose, no longer trembling. She wasn't just a seamstress now, she was the keeper of the truth. She folded the linen in half and began to sew, her stitches small, tight, and strong. She was creating a small, simple pouch. When it was finished, she placed the broken, sabotaged bolt inside. Then she folded the invoice and tucked it in beside the bolt. She sewed the top of the pouch shut, sealing the evidence within. The blue bag lay on the workbench between them, a simple object that held the power to shatter the fragile piece of gray butte. Judge Whitlow was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same weathered wood as his desk. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were clear and sharp. His office was an island of quiet order in the chaotic town, smelling of old books, pipe smoke, and justice. He listened patiently as Elise and Cade laid out their story. Elise spoke first, her voice low but steady, explaining her discovery of the oil and the score marks. Cade followed, placing the blue pouch on the judge's desk and explaining what Gus the blacksmith had told him. He opened the bag and showed the judge the invoice and the identical, shoddy bolt. Whitlow examined the evidence, his long, bony fingers turning the broken bolt over and over in the afternoon light. He sniffed the greasy smear on the wood of the broken crosspiece, which they had also brought. He read the invoice twice. Marlowe Clegg's warehouse, he said, his voice a dry rustle, and Kip Dorney, his man. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty window. The silence stretched. Elise could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, the judge looked at them. A smell is not proof. Mrs. Rowan and a blacksmith's story, while compelling, is still just one man's word against another's. He held up a hand as Elise's face fell. But this, he said, tapping the broken bolt, this is a deliberate act, and it warrants a closer look. He stood up. Come with me. He led them not to a sheriff's office. Gray Butte's lawman was notoriously ineffective and often in Clegg's pocket, but straight to the front door of the Gray Butte Bank. Marlowe Clegg received them in his office with a look of mild amusement. He remained seated behind his massive oak desk, a fortress of polished wood and money. Judge Whitlow and Mr. Hollis, Miss Rowan. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Judge Whitlow did not waste time with pleasantries. Mr. Clegg, there is reason to believe the failure of the town well was not an accident, but an act of sabotage. Clegg raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. Sabotage. My dear Judge, that sounds rather dramatic. The well is old. Things break. It is the nature of the world. A bolt was deliberately loosened. Whitlow continued, his voice as dry as dust, and the wood around the bolt hole bears the scent of a specific machine oil. An oil that Miss Rowan believes she has smelled coming from your private warehouse." Clegg's smile was thin and sharp. He leaned back in his chair, the very picture of offended innocence. He looked at Cade, his eyes glittering with contempt. "Of course. And who makes this accusation a Hollis?" He laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Judge, surely you know the history. The Hollis name and that well have been a source of trouble for 20 years. If the well is broken, it is the lingering curse of Jebediah Hollis's actions. It is the fault of bad blood, not bad bolts." Cade didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply took half a step closer to Elise, so his shoulder was almost touching hers. He stood there, silent, his presence a solid, unbreachable wall between her and Clegg's venom. He had learned his lesson. He would not fight her battles for her, but he would stand with her while she fought them. And in his stillness, Elise found an ocean of strength. The rumors began to shift that afternoon, like the wind before a storm. The story of the visit to the judge, and then to the bank, spread like wildfire. At first, it was disbelieving. But the details, the bolt, the invoice, the oil were specific. They were tangible. They were harder to dismiss than the vague, shadowy whispers of a family curse. In the saloon, men who had cursed Cade's name a week ago now spoke in hushed, speculative tones. "Sabotage. You say Dorney did buy a cheap bolt from Gus. And what is Clegg keeping in that warehouse?" Anyway, the foundation of the old narrative was cracking. That evening, Judge Whitlow posted a new notice. It was tacked to the door of the church. "A public hearing will be convened to investigate the failure of the Gray Butte Town well. Sunday morning, following the sermon. All interested parties are to be in attendance. Testimony will be heard. Evidence will be presented." The town held its breath. It was no longer a matter of whispers. It would be a public accounting, a trial held not in a formal courthouse, but in the moral center of the community. Elise spent that Saturday in the small makeshift classroom she had set up in a corner of her shop for a few of the town's children whose parents couldn't afford the formal school fees. She stood before them, a piece of charcoal in her hand, and drew large, careful letters on a piece of scrap slate. She had meant to teach them the word honesty or justice, but her own hands were trembling slightly, and the word that came out, the word she needed to hold on to herself, was different. "MERCY, she spelled out, her voice soft. "Mercy. It means choosing kindness when you have the power to choose punishment." The children dutifully copied the letters. As she watched them, her hand steadying, she prayed that on Sunday morning, Gray Butte would have the wisdom to know the difference. The news of the public hearing hit the saloon like a physical blow. Kip Dorney was halfway through a glass of watered-down whiskey when he heard the men at the next table talking. Hearing, Sunday morning, Judge Whitlow, evidence, his name. A low hiss passed from man to man. The whiskey turned to acid in his stomach. A cold, greasy sweat broke out on his forehead. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a tool, a wrench in Marlowe Clegg's well-oiled machine. And he knew what happened to tools when they were about to be identified as the weapon in a crime. They were discarded, buried. Clegg would cut him loose, deny everything, and leave him to twist in the wind. The full weight of the town's anger would fall on him, and him alone. Panic, raw and clawing, seized him. He had to run, but he couldn't just run. They had evidence. The little seamstress and that cursed Hollis. They had the bolt. But what else did they have? What else could tie him to the crime? The warehouse, the oil, the generator Clegg kept there. It was the source of the smell, the link between him and the sabotage. He couldn't leave that behind. A new, desperate plan formed in his mind, forged in fear. He wouldn't just run. He would erase the trail. He would burn it all to the ground. A fire, blamed on a faulty generator, would destroy any lingering proof. And in the ensuing chaos, he would be long gone. He slipped out the back door of the saloon, his mind a frantic scramble. He needed supplies, a can of kerosene, matches, and his horse, saddled and ready. It was Saturday, the busiest day of the week in Gray Butte. The cattle market was in full swing. The vast network of pens and corrals at the east end of town was a churning, chaotic sea of livestock and men. Longhorn cattle, their horns a terrifying span of sharp polished bone, were being prodded and chivied through narrow chutes. The air was a thick, palpable thing, a choking mixture of dust, manure, and the smell of hot, anxious animals. The noise was a constant, deafening roar, the lowing of 1,000 cattle, the sharp cracks of whips, the hoarse shouts of drovers and buyers. It was a perfect storm of confusion. It was the perfect cover for a getaway. Cade saw him first. He and Elise had arranged to meet Judge Whitlow near the church an hour before noon to formally submit the blue pouch of evidence. Cade had been waiting, his buckskin tied to the rail, his eyes scanning the street, a knot of anticipation tightening in his gut. He didn't trust Clegg to simply wait for Sunday. He saw Dorney scuttling out of the mercantile's side entrance, not with a small parcel, but with a heavy can, the distinctive red tin of kerosene. Dorney wasn't heading for home. He was moving quickly, furtively, toward the alley that led to the back of the bank, toward the warehouse. Cade didn't need to think. He knew. He untied his horse in one swift motion, swinging into the saddle. He saw 2 hands from the Sweetwater Ranch, men he knew and trusted, watching a cattle auction. Jed Silas Cade's voice cut through the din. Dorney's making a run for it. He's headed for Clegg's warehouse. We have to stop him. The 2 cowboys exchanged a single glance, then nodded. The shared hardship of the drought and the simmering resentment toward Clegg were all the explanation they needed. They mounted their horses, their movements economical and swift. The chase began. Dorney, hearing the sudden thunder of hooves behind him, threw a panicked look over his shoulder. He saw Cade, his face set like granite, and 2 other riders fanning out behind him. He abandoned any pretense of stealth. He spurred his horse, a scrawny-looking bay, into a desperate gallop, plunging directly into the maelstrom of the cattle market. It was like diving into a storm surge. The 3 riders followed, their horses expertly weaving through the chaos. Cattle, spooked by the sudden charge, scattered in every direction, their hooves churning the dry ground into a thick, brown fog. Dust billowed up, thick as wool, reducing visibility to a few feet. The world became a claustrophobic hell of brown haze, bellowing horns, and the splintering crash of wood as panicked steers broke through flimsy corral fences. Shouts of anger and surprise rose from the drovers on the ground, but they were swallowed by the noise and the dust. Elise had just arrived, riding the Reverend's gentle but sturdy mare. She clutched the blue linen pouch to her chest, the hard shapes of the bolt and the folded invoice a solid reassurance against her ribs. She saw the sudden eruption of chaos at the far end of the market, saw Cade's unmistakable form disappear into the swirling brown cloud. Her blood ran cold. She understood instantly. Dorney wasn't just running, he was running to destroy the last pieces of the puzzle. The evidence in her hands was suddenly not just a collection of facts, but a target. Without a second thought, she urged the mare forward, her heart pounding in time with the horse's gait. She was not a confident rider, but a desperate resolve gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She held the reins in one hand and pressed the blue pouch tight against her body with the other. A small, determined figure riding into the heart of the storm. Kip Dorney was a cornered rat. He could hear the relentless pursuit behind him. Closer now. He reached the wide double doors of the warehouse, leaping from his still-moving horse. The kerosene can sloshed in his hand. He fumbled with the heavy iron latch, his fingers slick with sweat. He wrenched the door open. Inside, he could see the dark, greasy shape of the generator. His goal was just a few feet away. He didn't see Cade closing in from the side, using a stampeding herd of steers as a moving screen. As Dorney prepared to hurl the kerosene, Cade's buckskin burst from the dust cloud. Dorney reacted with pure animal instinct. He didn't throw the can at the generator. He spun around and hurled it under the belly of Cade's horse. The tin can clattered on the damp-packed earth and bricks just inside the warehouse threshold, its contents gushing out in a dark, shimmering puddle. Dorney, in the same motion, struck a match on his belt buckle. He tossed the sputtering flame toward the spill. A whoosh of orange flame erupted, a hungry, roaring beast that licked at the ground. But the earth and brick near the warehouse door kept perpetually damp from runoff. refused to catch. The fire burned hot and fast on the surface of the spilled fuel, a terrifying but shallow pool of flame that produced more black, oily smoke than consuming heat. It wasn't the inferno Dorney had hoped for. It was a failed, smoky tantrum. The wall of fire, however brief, forced Cade's horse to rear back. It was the opening Dorney needed. He scrambled for his own horse, intent on making his final escape. But he hadn't counted on Cade's skill. Cade brought his horse under control with a savage pull on the reins. He didn't try to go through the flames. He went around. He spurred the buckskin in a tight, brutal arc, forcing his horse alongside Dorney's panicked mount. He leaned out of the saddle, his entire body a lever of focused force. He didn't draw a weapon. He used his horse, his body, his momentum. He slammed into Dorney, knocking him clean out of his saddle. Kip Dorney hit the ground with a heavy, dust-exploding thud. The air rushed from his lungs in a pained gasp. Before he could recover, Cade was off his own horse, one knee pinning Dorney's chest, one hand twisting Dorney's arm behind his back. Just then, Elise arrived, her mare skittish from the smell of smoke. She slid from the saddle, her eyes wide, the blue pouch still clutched in her hand. She saw Cade holding the struggling, gasping Dorney. Dorney's wild eyes latched onto the blue bag in her hand. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he twisted, his free hand lashing out, trying to rip the evidence from her grasp. "Give me that," he shrieked. Elise stumbled back, but his fingers snagged the corner of the bag. For a heart-stopping second, they were locked in a tug-of-war over the truth. Cade applied more pressure, and Dorney screamed in pain, his grip loosening. Elise yanked the bag free, pulling it back to the safety of her chest, her knuckles white. The fight was gone from him, pinned, defeated, and terrified. Kip Dorney's bravado shattered completely. He started to babble, his words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. "It wasn't my idea, I was just doing what I was told. He made me do it, he who Cade's voice was cold iron. Clegg, it was Clegg." Dorney screamed, his face contorted with fear and rage. "He said to make it look like an accident. All the stuff is in the warehouse out back. The oil, the records. I was just doing a job." In his panic, he had confessed everything, pointing the finger directly at the man in the clean suit in the polished office. By now, the chaos had drawn a crowd. Drovers, ranchers, and townsfolk pushed forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning anger, forming a tight, suffocating circle around them. The failed fire hissed and sputtered out, leaving a black, greasy stain on the ground and a thick, acrid pall of smoke in the air. Suddenly, Judge Whitlow's voice boomed over the crowd. "Stand back, give them room, let order prevail." He pushed his way to the center, his face grim. At that moment, as if summoned by the judge's words, the church bell began to toll. It was noon. The sound, usually a placid marker of the day, now seemed to ring with a solemn, final judgment. Cade slowly got to his feet, pulling Dorney up with him and shoving him into the custody of Jed and Silas. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He looked at Elise. She was standing amidst the chaos, her hair coming undone, a smudge of black on her cheek. She looked frightened, but she was standing straight. He reached up, not to touch her, but to take off his hat. He held it for a moment, then gently, carefully, placed it over her head, letting the wide brim shield her hair and face from the falling ash and the hard, accusing glare of the sun. The noonday sun beat down, hot and merciless. The air was a thick cocktail of smells, the sharp stink of kerosene, the bitter scent of burnt grass, the animal tang of sweat and fear. It was the smell of a desperate, violent truth being dragged into the light. And then, something changed. A shadow fell over the square. A single, large, dark cloud had moved to block the sun, its edges tinged with a strange, bruised light. The wind, which had been still, suddenly gusted, but from a new direction. It was a cool wind, carrying the distant, loamy smell of rain. The weather was turning. The wind had changed. The interior of the Gray Butte church smelled of dry pine, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of 100 Sunday sermons. It was not a house of law, but on this morning, it had become one. The townsfolk packed the pews, not with the quiet reverence of worship, but with the tense, hungry anticipation of a public spectacle. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and anxious hope. Light filtered through the plain, colored glass of the windows, painted soft lozenges of amber and blue on the worn floorboards, a peaceful beauty that was at odds with the tension in the air. At the front, where the pulpit usually stood, Judge Whitlow had placed a simple pine table. It was his bench. Upon it sat a heavy, leather-bound Bible and a single, unlit kerosene lamp, as if to suggest that light, in one form or another, would be brought to the proceedings. Kip Dorney, looking small and pale, was seated on a stool to one side, guarded by Jed and Silas from the Sweetwater Ranch. Marlowe Clegg, by contrast, arrived as if he were attending a business meeting at which he was the guest of honor. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, his shirt a stark, pristine white against the rustic backdrop of the church. He nodded to a few of the more prominent townsfolk, a confident, patronizing smile on his lips. He walked to the front and stood before the table, a picture of calm, untouchable authority. "Mr. Clegg." Judge Whitlow's voice was as dry as old parchment. "Please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right." Clegg did so, his smooth, uncalloused hand looking alien on the cracked leather of the holy book. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "So help you God, I do," Clegg said, his voice ringing with a sincerity that was chilling in its perfection. The judge gestured to a chair opposite Dorney's stool. "Please be seated." He then turned his gaze to the packed pews. "Miss Elise Rowan." A hush fell over the room. Elise stood, her heart hammering. Cade, sitting beside her, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't encouragement. It was a statement of fact. "You can do this." She walked the long aisle to the front, the sound of her own footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. She clutched the small, blue linen pouch in her hand. It felt both heavy and light, a burden and a shield. She did not have to swear on the Bible. The judge simply asked her to present her findings. Her voice, when she began, was low and trembled slightly, but it gained strength as she spoke. She didn't offer opinions or accusations. She simply told them what she had seen. After the incident, she began, "I examined the pulley mechanism. The bolt had not simply broken. There were fresh marks on the head, from a wrench." She paused, letting the words settle, and in the wood, around the hole, there was a smear of oil, a thin machine oil, not wagon grease. She then opened the blue pouch. The small sounds of the fabric, the clink of metal, were sharp and clear in the quiet room. She placed the broken, sabotaged bolt on the table. Then, she unfolded the greasy invoice from the blacksmith shop and laid it beside the bolt. "This is the bolt that failed," she said, her voice clear now, unwavering. "And this is an invoice from Gus's Forge for a special order, high-tensile steel bolt of the exact same size, an order placed by Mr. Kip Dorney 2 weeks ago, an order he never paid for and never collected." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Clegg's perfect smile tightened at the edges. "Gus," the judge called out. The blacksmith heaved himself out of a pew that groaned in protest. He walked to the front, his heavy work boots thudding on the floorboards. He looked at the bolt on the table. "That's the cheap one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Cast iron. The one Dorney bought from me 3 days back. Said he was in a hurry. I told him it was junk. I still have the good one he ordered, the one on this invoice." He pointed a thick, soot-stained finger at the paper. He looked me in the eye and lied about what he needed it for. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Judge Whitlow held up a hand for silence. He turned his attention back to Clegg. "Mr. Clegg, this oil Miss Rowan describes, she has stated that she smelled a similar odor coming from your private warehouse behind the bank." Clegg laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "An odor, Judge. This is becoming a farce. You're entertaining the fanciful notions of a hysterical woman and the grumblings of a blacksmith, all instigated by a Hollis." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescending reason. "I have a generator in my warehouse. Of course it uses oil. Is that a crime now in Gray Butte? Am I to be held responsible for every bolt my employees purchase or every smell a newcomer imagines?" Before the judge could respond, Reverend Miller stood. "Judge, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of his station. He held up a thin, brittle-looking document. "This is the original town charter, from 1851. It states quite clearly, right here in the third article, that the Gray Butte Town Well, and the land it sits upon, is to be held in public trust. It belongs to the people of this community, to be managed by the church and the town council for the common good. It is not, and has never been, private property to be administered for a fee by any single individual or business." The final piece had clicked into place. The motive was now as clear as the crime itself. Clegg's fee was illegal. His attempt to seize control of the well was a direct violation of the town's founding covenant. All eyes turned to Marlowe Clegg. The mask of civility was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped fury. He saw the trap closing. He did what cornered, powerful men always do. He deflected. He sacrificed his pawn. He slowly turned his head and fixed Kip Dorney with a look of pure, cold venom. "I see it now," he said, his voice laced with theatrical disgust. This weasel." He gestured at Dorney as if he were a piece of filth. "He has been in my employ. Yes, but he is a gambler, a drunkard. I have had to cover his debts. He must have done this on his own, thinking he could somehow curry favor with me, or perhaps extort me. I am as much a victim of his despicable scheme as anyone in this town. I had no knowledge of his actions. I wash my hands of him completely." Kip Dorney, who had been shrinking on his stool, seemed to snap. The terror in his eyes was replaced by the rage of the betrayed. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted. "Liar," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You told me to do it. You said to make it look like an accident. You said it would force Hollis to sell a competent overseer. You said, that's what you wanted them to call you." He was pointing a trembling finger at Clegg, his confession a torrent of panicked, self-serving truth. "You're the boss. I just did what the boss told me to do." The church erupted. The carefully maintained order shattered into 100 angry conversations. Men were on their feet, shouting. It was a verdict delivered not by a judge, but by the raw, unified voice of a community that had been lied to, manipulated, and brought to the brink. Throughout the entire ugly exchange between Clegg and Dorney, Cade Hollis did not look at them once. He had seen enough liars and bullies in his life to know that their venom was only potent if you faced it. Instead, he watched Elise. He watched her stand her ground, her hands clasped in front of her, her back straight. He watched her present the truth, clean and unadorned, and then stand back and let that truth do its work. When Dorney's confession finally sealed Clegg's fate, Cade turned his head and looked at her. He didn't smile. He simply gave her that same, small, almost imperceptible nod from before. It was a gesture of profound respect. A thank you, not for saving him, but for believing that a person could stand straight on their own, and for showing him how it was done. Judge Whitlow banged a heavy book on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Order," he roared. "Order in the house of God." The crowd slowly fell silent. The judge looked at Marlowe Clegg, his face carved from stone. "Mr. Clegg, this body finds that you conspired to deliberately damage public property for the purpose of personal gain. You will pay for the complete repair of the well, including the cost of a new pulley mechanism to be forged by Gus. You will pay a fine of $500 to the town treasury. And your illegal water fee is hereby abolished, effective immediately." He looked out at the exhausted faces in the pews. "This hearing is adjourned. We will all go home and have our lunch." It was over, just like that. The tension broke, and the townsfolk began to file out, not in a chaotic rush, but in a slow, dazed procession. Their voices were low now, the anger replaced by a weary, dawning sense of justice. Elise could hear fragments of their conversations as they passed. "Never did trust that Clegg. To think, we blamed the Hollis boy, that seamstress. She's got a spine of iron. A new story was being written, a new rumor taking root. Maybe the Hollis name didn't bring drought. Maybe, just maybe, it brought the rain." Soon, the church was almost empty. Elise and Cade remained in their pew, the quiet descending around them like a soft blanket. Cade reached down and picked up his hat from the floor where it had been resting. It was the one he had worn to the cattle market, not the one he had sacrificed to the well. He didn't put it on. He held it in his hands for a moment, then gently, deliberately, placed it on the empty space on the pew beside him. He set it down. He turned to Elise, his voice low in the cavernous room. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For teaching me how to pull on the same rope." A small, genuine smile touched Elise's lips for the first time that day. It was a smile of shared understanding, of a partnership forged in adversity. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for knowing when to wear your hat and when to take it off." He met her gaze, and in the quiet of the church, something shifted. A wall he had spent a lifetime building had, without his noticing, been taken down, not by force, but by the steady, quiet work of a woman with a needle and a belief in the truth. They walked out of the church together, into the noon sun. Outside, the world seemed new. The large, dark cloud that had hung over the town during the chase had begun to break apart, torn by the changing wind. Bright, clean shafts of sunlight pierced through, banishing the shadows. In the center of the square, the dark, skeletal outline of the broken well was cast upon the ground. But the sun was high overhead now, and the shadow it made was short, no longer the long, menacing finger of the early morning. The crisis had passed. The afternoon air grew heavy and still. The oppressive heat of the sun lessened, muted by the high, gray belly of the cloud that had drifted over the valley. Then came the first drop of rain. It fell not as a mist, but as a single, fat, heavy pellet that struck the dust in the center of the square with an audible plop, creating a dark, star-shaped crater. Another followed, then another. A collective, indrawn breath seemed to pass through Gray Butte. On the wooden boardwalks, the ancient, sun-bleached planks began to darken as the drops landed, and a low, percussive sound began, a soft tack, 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 as the dry wood swelled, tightening against the nails that held it down. The smell of the air changed, the sharp, choking smell of dust giving way to the rich, dark, living scent of petrichor, the perfume of rain on thirsty earth. There was no rush to take cover. People emerged from the mercantile and the saloon, not to escape the weather, but to witness it. They stood under awnings, their faces turned upward, letting the first real rain in months touch their skin. It was a baptism, a release. At the town well, the real work was being done. Gus the blacksmith had forged a new pulley wheel, a heavy, perfectly balanced circle of black iron. The crosspiece had been replaced with a new, thick beam of seasoned oak. Now, with the rain beginning to fall in earnest, the three of them, Gus, Cade, and Elise, worked together to set it in place. It was a slow, careful process, a dance of leverage and strength. Gus directed, his voice a low rumble. Cade provided the raw power, his muscles straining as he heaved the heavy timber into position. But it was Elise who did the fine work. It was her nimble fingers that guided the new, oiled bolt through the holes, her steady hand that tightened the nut, not with brute force, but with a patient, firm precision that seated it perfectly. When it was done, they threaded the old rope through the new wheel. Gus spat on his hands and took the crank. He gave it a turn. There was no groan, no shriek of tortured metal. There was only a low, smooth whir, the sound of well-oiled iron turning on a perfectly fitted axle. The rope slid through its groove with a sound as soft and steady as a person breathing in their sleep. Gus nodded, satisfied. "That'll hold," he grunted, and with a final look at the darkening sky, he headed back to the shelter of his forge. Cade and Elise stood alone by the well as the rain began to fall more steadily, no longer in individual drops but in a dense, cooling sheet. It slicked Cade's dark hair to his head and beaded on the shoulders of Elise's simple cotton dress. For a long moment, they watched the water darken the stones of the well, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the new pulley as the wind turned it slightly. Elise looked away from the well, out at the town square where the rain was turning the dust to a dark, rich mud, smoothing over the scuffs of boots and the tracks of wheels, washing everything clean. "What if it comes back?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the falling rain, the talk, the whispers. A rumor is a hard weed to kill. What do we do if it grows back? Cade didn't answer right away. He looked at the rope, coiled and waiting. He looked at the crank handle, now clean and dark with rain. He thought of the years he had spent standing straight, his back to the whispers, a solitary defense that had only deepened his isolation. He had been pulling on that rope alone his whole life. Now, something was different. "Then we'll pull again," he said, his voice low and certain. He turned to look at her, and his gaze was as steady as the falling rain. Together. The word hung in the air between them, simple and solid. It was not a promise of victory or an assurance that the fight was over. It was something more real. It was a promise of partnership, a promise that she would not have to stand alone, and neither would he. The rain intensified, the sky opening up completely. It was a deluge now, a true drought-breaking storm. The water ran in rivulets down the street, filling the cracks in the earth. Elise, instinctively, took a step back, seeking the meager shelter of the blacksmith's awning. She stood under the overhang, the rain forming a curtain of silver just beyond her reach. The cool spray misted her face. She looked at Cade, who remained standing by the well, seemingly indifferent to the downpour. A solitary figure in the heart of the storm. She saw the strength in him, the quiet endurance that had allowed him to survive the town's scorn for so long. And she saw the change in him, the subtle softening of the lines around his eyes, the new stillness in his posture that was not resignation, but peace. She raised a hand and placed it flat against her chest, over her heart. The events of the past few days, the fear, the fight, the public hearing, the quiet victory all swirled within her. She had asked him a question in a moment of sheer desperation, a cry for a lesson in human decency. Now, in this moment of quiet, cleansing rain, the question returned, not as a cry for help, but as a hopeful, hesitant prayer. "Please," she said, her voice soft but clear over the drumming of the rain, "show me what love is supposed to feel like." He heard her. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking with hers through the shimmering curtain of water. He didn't speak. His movements were slow, deliberate, filled with a meaning that words could not convey. He reached up and took off his hat, the rain immediately plastering his hair to his scalp. He held the hat in his hand, a familiar gesture of respect that now felt deeply personal, an act of disarmament. He began to walk toward her, his steps unhurried. He didn't close the distance completely. He stopped just outside the curtain of rain, leaving a small, respectful space between them. The water dripped from his chin, from the tips of his eyelashes. "It feels like this," he said, his voice a low rumble, as gentle as the rain itself. "We ask before we touch." Elise's breath caught in her throat. Her past with Arthur had been one of assumptions, of ownership, of a touch that was a claim, not a question. Cade's words were a revelation, a complete reordering of the world she had known. Love wasn't a taking. It was an offering, a respectful, gentle inquiry. She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of understanding and acceptance that was more profound than any vow. He held out his hand, not to take hers, but palm up, an invitation. She took a step out from under the shelter of the awning, into the rain, and placed her hand in his. His skin was warm and rough, a stark contrast to the cool rain. He didn't entwine his fingers with hers. He simply held her hand, a shared anchor in the storm. Together, they walked back to the well. A bucket sat on the stone lip, and the rain was drumming into it, filling it with clean, pure water from the sky. Cade reached down with his free hand and tipped it slightly, pouring half the rainwater out. Then, still holding her hand, he cranked the handle of the new pulley. The bucket descended into the earth with a soft, whispering hum. He brought it back up, filled with the dark, cold, mineral-rich water from the deep well. He set the bucket, brimming with well water, back on the stone ledge. They stood on either side of it, their hands still joined, and watched as the heavy, steady rain fell into the bucket. They watched as the water from the heavens and the water from the earth, the gift and the struggle, mingled and became one. The rain had traced a faint, dark line on Elise's cheek, a trail of soot left over from the fire at the warehouse. Cade saw it. He released her hand and reached into his pocket, pulling out a clean, dry kerchief. He unfolded it. He didn't simply wipe her face. He paused, his eyes asking the question his voice had already taught her. She gave another small nod. Gently, with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible in a man of his size and roughness, he brushed the cloth against her skin, wiping away the last trace of the day's ugliness. In the distance, the evening church bell began to ring, its deep, resonant tones softened by the thick, wet air. The sound was no longer a summons to judgment, but a call to rest, to peace. From the holding pens at the edge of town, the lowing of the cattle carried on the wind, a gentle, melodic sound, like a lullaby for a world being washed clean. They retreated to the shelter of the livery stable's wide doorway. The air inside was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Cade took his soaked hat and hung it on a wooden peg on the wall. It was a simple act, but it felt like a declaration. A hat hung up was a hat at rest, a man at peace in his own home. Outside, the great cottonwood tree by the well, its leaves scoured clean by the storm, drank its fill. It had been a stark, thirsty silhouette for months. Now, its leaves were heavy, its branches bowed, weighted down with the life-giving water it had so long been denied. It was no longer alone. It was full. The rain that was a blessing to Grey Butte was a torment to Marlowe Clegg. He sat in his office, the door closed against the sounds of the newly hopeful town, and listened to the steady, relentless drumming on the roof. Each drop was a mockery. Each rivulet of water that ran down his window pane was a tiny stream of his influence, his power, his control, washing away into the mud. The town had water. The town had a hero. The town had a villain. And for the first time in his life, Marlowe Clegg was on the wrong side of that ledger. He was not a man to accept defeat. He had been outmaneuvered. Yes. Humiliated. Certainly. But destroyed, no. His power was not just in the well. It was in the intricate web of debt and obligation that bound Grey Butte to his bank like a fly to a web. He opened his main ledger, the thick, leather-bound book that was the town's true scripture. He ran a manicured finger down the list of names until it stopped. Hollis, Cade, the mortgage on the winter pasture. It was a significant debt, taken out by his father years ago after a disastrous cattle fever. The payments were due seasonally, and the largest one, the one that truly mattered, was due in 1 week. A cold, thin smile returned to Clegg's lips. The well had been a blunt instrument. This was a scalpel. This was not a public spectacle. This was the cold, quiet, unassailable logic of the law. He took out a fresh sheet of paper and, in his perfect, elegant script, penned a formal notice of intent to foreclose. He would not threaten. He would not bluster. He would simply serve the notice and wait. Let Hollis be the hero of the well. Clegg would be the owner of the land that kept his cattle alive. The notice arrived the next day, delivered by a grim-faced clerk. Cade took the envelope and read the single sheet of paper inside. The words were simple, legal, and as final as a gravestone. Pay the full balance in 7 days, or the bank takes the land. The winter pasture was everything. It was the sheltered valley with the creek that never ran dry, the place where his herd survived the brutal, snow-filled months. Without it, his ranch was a slow death sentence. His first thought was immediate, practical, and utterly ruinous. The new calves. He had a small but healthy herd of them, this year's crop, the future of his ranch. A cattle buyer from the next county was in town. If he sold them all now, at a cut-rate price for a quick sale, he might just have enough to pay Clegg off. He would be crippled for years, his breeding stock gone, but he would keep the land. He found Elise in her shop, a small lamp lit against the gray, rainy afternoon. She was mending a child's dress, her needle working a tiny, perfect seam. He didn't know why he had come to her, only that the thought of making this decision alone was unbearable. He laid the foreclosure notice on her cutting table. "He's found another way," Cade said, his voice flat and hard. I have to sell the calves. It's the only way. Elise read the notice, her face growing pale. She looked up at him, at the raw desperation in his eyes, the look of a man about to perform surgery on himself with a rusty knife. She put down her sewing and stood up, placing her hand gently on his arm. Cade, no, she said, her voice soft but firm. Don't chop down the root to save the leaves. The words hung in the air between them, a simple, devastating truth. He was about to sacrifice his future to save his present. He was about to win the battle and lose the war. He sank onto the small stool beside her table, the fight suddenly draining out of him, replaced by a vast, weary emptiness. Then what do I do? Elise, I have 7 days. You are not alone in this, she said. You are not the only one who owes a debt to that well. The idea came to them then, born in the quiet of the small shop, surrounded by the tools of mending and making whole. The next morning, a new sign appeared outside her shop, hand-lettered on a piece of clean, white linen, the mending market. 1 bucket of good mending in exchange for 1 bucket of water, or a fair coin, for the community well fund. It was a radical idea. It turned charity into commerce, desperation into a currency of shared work. The first to arrive was the wife of a dirt farmer from the edge of town, her arms overflowing with torn work shirts and patched overalls. She looked embarrassed. I don't have a coin to spare, she mumbled. Your husband's labor tore these shirts, Elise said with a warm smile. My labor will mend them. It's an even trade. The woman left with a lighter heart, leaving behind a promise to contribute 2 buckets of water once the well was fully operational. A child came next, shyly offering a doll with a torn arm. Cade, who was sitting awkwardly in the corner, took the doll and, with a few clumsy but effective stitches using a thick needle and twine, reattached the limb. The child's mother added a nickel to the small wooden box they had placed on the table, slowly. Then all at once, the town responded. They came not just with mending, but with what they had. A woman brought a jar of pickled beans. A rancher dropped off a sack of potatoes. Gus, the blacksmith, after delivering the fully repaired wellhead, refused payment and instead forged a second, spare pulley wheel, just in case. He grunted and set it against the wall of Elise's shop. Reverend Miller arrived with a hammer and nails. He tacked a carefully copied version of the town charter's article on the well to the new oak crosspiece itself, a permanent, public declaration of ownership for all to see. The town was no longer just a collection of individuals struggling to survive. It was a community, weaving itself back together, 1 stitch, 1 potato, 1 act of defiance at a time. Marlowe Clegg saw it all from his window. He saw the growing pile of goods outside the seamstress's shop. He saw the copy of the charter on the well. He saw the spirit of the town shifting, coalescing into something he could not control with ledgers and laws. That evening, he decided to remind them where the real power lay. He walked into the saloon, intending to buy a round of drinks, to spread a little money around, to remind the men of Gray Butte who paid the bills. The saloon was quiet when he entered. The men at the bar looked up, and then, without a word, looked away. The usual boisterous camaraderie was gone, replaced by a cool, watchful silence. "A round for the house," Clegg announced, his voice a little too loud in the still room. To celebrate the return of the rain, no one moved. Jed, the cowboy from the Sweetwater Ranch, who was usually the first to accept a free drink, slowly set his glass down. "We're fine. Clegg," he said, his voice level, "the water's free now. We don't need you to buy our whiskey." The rejection was absolute, as sharp and clean as a slap in the face. Clegg stood there for a moment, his offer hanging in the air like sour smoke. He had lost them. His money, for the first time, was no good here. He turned and walked out, the silence of the room a far greater insult than any shout. The final blow came the next morning. A large farm wagon, loaded high with bales of fresh, sweet-smelling hay, rumbled down the main street. It didn't stop at the livery. It pulled up directly in front of Cade's small, struggling ranch. At the reins was Tess Calder, the wife of the owner of the Circle C, the largest and most respected ranch in the valley. She was a woman of few words and great standing. Her actions spoke for the entire ranching community. Cade came out of his barn, his face a mask of disbelief. "Mrs. Calder," he said, removing his hat. "What is this?" Tess Calder looked down from the high wagon seat, her weathered face kind but resolute. "My husband and I have watered our stock at that well for 30 years. Mr. Hollis, we've never paid a cent, because that was the agreement. The well belongs to everyone." She gestured with her chin toward the hay. "Your father helped pull my husband's wagon out of a ditch in the blizzard of '72. He never asked for anything in return." She paused, her gaze steady. "It's our turn to repay the well. Your herd will eat this winter." Clegg, watching from his window, finally understood. He had lost. He had lost the well. He had lost the people. And now, he had lost the power of his foreclosure. Cade Hollis was no longer an isolated man with a cursed name. He was the center of a community that was actively and publicly supporting him. To foreclose now would not be a business transaction. It would be an act of war against the entire town, and he no longer had the army to fight it. He walked across the street, his steps slow and heavy. He did not go to Cade's ranch. He went to Elise's shop. He knocked politely on the doorframe. "Miss Rowan, Mr. Hollis," he said, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. It was the voice of a man negotiating the terms of his surrender. "May I have a word?" He tried to bargain. He offered to extend the loan, to lower the interest, to forget the whole unfortunate business. He just wanted to find a way to preserve the dignity of all parties involved. He wanted to save face. Cade listened, his expression unreadable. When Clegg had finished, Cade spoke, his voice quiet but unyielding. He didn't want a better deal on the loan. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. "First," Cade said, "you will pay Gus for the full cost of the well repairs, as the judge ordered." He paused. "Second, you will make a public apology. Not to me, to Miss Rowan. You will stand in the town square and you will apologize for the lies your man told about her, for the damage you tried to do to her good name." Clegg stared, aghast. An apology. Publicly to a seamstress. It was a demand more costly to his pride than any amount of money. He looked at Elise, expecting her to add her own demands, to ask for a cash settlement for the slander. But Elise simply shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Clegg," she said, her voice clear and calm. "Any financial compensation the judge deems appropriate for the trouble you've caused me, you will donate directly to the Community Well Fund." She gestured to the small box on her table, which was now overflowing with coins and scrawled IOUs. "The well takes care of the town. We will take care of the well." Clegg looked from Cade's unbending expression to Elise's quiet strength. He saw no weakness, no opening, no room to negotiate. He had been completely and utterly defeated, not by force of arms, but by the stubborn, resilient decency of two people and the community they had awakened. He gave a single, stiff nod. That evening, as the sun set, the rain finally stopped. A profound quiet settled over Gray Butte, the only sound the soft dripping of water from the eaves and the distant, contented lowing of cattle. The church bell rang out, its notes clear and peaceful in the clean, washed air. The town was quiet, listening to the sound of the rain soaking deep, deep into the heart of the ground. The Sunday morning sun rose over a world washed clean. The air, scrubbed by the rain, was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet scent of damp earth and new beginnings. In the town square of Gray Butte, the mud was already beginning to dry, leaving the ground a rich, dark brown, and the sky was a vast, cloudless, impossible blue. The town gathered not for a crisis, but for a quiet celebration. They didn't stand in a desperate, thirsty line. Instead, they formed a loose, smiling circle around the well, watching as Elise Rowan took the crank handle. The new pulley mechanism, forged and fitted with care, was a symbol of their collective victory. The new oak beam gleamed with a light coat of oil, and the rope was clean and strong. Elise leaned into the work, The crank turned with a smooth, satisfying hum. The rope slid effortlessly through the new iron wheel. There was no groan of protest, no shriek of failing metal. There was only the sound of efficient, honest labor. She brought the bucket up from the darkness, her movement steady and sure. It rose over the stone lip of the well, brimming with clear, cold water, so full that the surface formed a perfect, convex dome. She set it down on the stones without spilling a single drop. A soft, spontaneous round of applause broke out from the assembled townsfolk. It was a sound of deep, heartfelt relief, an acknowledgement of a battle won and a community restored. Cade Hollis, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, walked forward. He didn't come to take the bucket from her. He came to stand opposite her, a partner in the task she had mastered. He bent down and placed his broad, calloused hands under the bottom of the heavy wooden bucket, not to lift it, but to steady it. He looked directly at her, his gaze clear and open. "Hold it like this," he said, his voice low, meant only for her, but his words carrying the weight of a universal truth. "Share the load, and look at each other." It was the final lesson. Not just how to carry water, but how to carry the weight of a life, a partnership, a future. It was about balance and trust and the courage to meet another's eyes and see an equal. At that moment, a path cleared through the crowd. Judge Whitlow, his face stern, escorted Marlowe Clegg to the front. Clegg looked pale and diminished in the bright morning sun. He held a piece of paper in his trembling hand. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Elise. He stared at a point somewhere in the middle distance, and in a flat, monotone voice, he read his apology. He spoke of his regret over the unfortunate and misleading statements made by his former employee regarding Miss Rowan's character and financial standing. He acknowledged his error in judgment in imposing the well fee. The words were hollow, but their public utterance was not. It was a formal surrender, a public stripping of the power he had wielded for so long. When he finished, he folded the paper and walked away, not a titan of finance, but just a small, defeated man. Kip Dorney was then brought forward. He sullenly signed the document Judge Whitlow presented, binding him to 3 months of hard, unpaid labor, repairing the very town property he had tried to destroy. The town's justice, like its new well, was simple, practical, and strong. The crowd began to disperse, their work done, their victory secure. They went back to their homes and their lives, leaving the square in a state of quiet peace. Elise turned to Cade, a small, private smile on her lips. From a small basket at her feet, she took out a folded piece of cloth. It was a simple neckerchief, made of dark, serviceable cotton. But on one corner, she had embroidered a single word. She had used the brilliant, startlingly blue thread he had left for her on her table, what seemed like a lifetime ago. The word was gentle. She held it out to him. It was not a payment. It was a gift. It was a mirror, reflecting the man he was becoming. Cade took the cloth, his rough fingers tracing the outline of the letters. He looked at the word, and then at her, and a profound understanding passed between them. He had lived his life behind a wall of hardness, a necessary armor against the world's cruelty. But she had shown him that true strength was not in that wall, but in the courage to take it down. He folded the neckerchief carefully. Then, he took off his hat and pressed it to his chest, over his heart, a gesture of solemn, ultimate respect. "I'll learn," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not yet have a name for. "I'll learn to be gentle, every day." He set his hat down on the lip of the well. They bent down, one on each side of the full bucket of water. They gripped the rope handle together. They lifted, their movements synchronized, a shared, silent rhythm. Their shoulders brushed. No one pulled harder than the other. They shared the load. They began to walk, carrying the bucket between them, down the main street toward her small shop. They stopped under the shade of the great cottonwood tree. The leaves, washed clean and heavy with rain, rustled in the soft breeze. The air was cool and sweet. He gently took her side of the handle, freeing her hand. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his eyes asking the question he now knew was the foundation of all true things. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was a short kiss, as brief and as real as a single drop of rain. There was no fire in it, no desperate, consuming passion. It was steady, and it was sure. It tasted of clean water and the promise of tomorrow. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the quiet, unspoken sealing of a partnership, a promise of shared labor, of looking at each other, of holding on together. The sound of the well, as people began to use it again, was different now. The new pulley gave it a full, round, resonant voice, a sound of health and abundance. The distant clatter of a wagon and the slow, rhythmic clopping of a horse's hooves signaled the return of normal life. The saloon, that afternoon, was filled not with the poison of rumor, but with the sound of men laughing, their voices easy and relaxed for the first time in months. Elise Rowan and Cade Hollis walked the rest of the way down the dusty road, the full bucket of water swinging gently between them. It was a shared weight, a shared prize, a shared heart, just learning how to beat softly and in time. In Grey Butte, for years to come, they would tell the story. They would say that the great drought of '81 didn't end with the coming of the rain. It ended the day a good man's hat was taken off at just the right time. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support means the world to us, and hitting that hype button helps ensure these stories are heard by more people.